This is True Crime Stories for Sleep. London, 1888. The air hung heavy with fog, blanketing the cobblestone streets of Whitechapel in an unsettling silence broken only by the creak of carriage wheels and the hushed murmurs of those brave enough to wander through the night. In the dim light of gas lamps, shadows stretched across narrow alleys lined with crumbling lodging houses, overcrowded tenements, and the constant stench of poverty. It was an era of deep division, where the wealth of the upper classes contrasted sharply with the deprivation of the working poor. Amid the darkness, fear began to spread like wildfire as whispers of a murderer stalking the streets took hold. A killer was on the loose, one whose crimes would become infamous across the globe and whose name would be etched into history, Jack the Ripper. Before we begin unraveling this chilling story, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from and which case you'd like us to cover next. Your support helps us dive deeper into the darkest mysteries in history. Whitechapel was a perfect hunting ground for a predator. The district was home to thousands living in dire conditions: immigrants, laborers, and women forced into sex work to survive. Crime was rampant, alcohol flowed freely, and tensions ran high. Against this backdrop, the Ripper murders began, shattering what little sense of safety the residents clung to. The first known victim, Marianne Nichols, was discovered in the early hours of August 31, 1888, in Bucks Row. Her throat had been viciously slashed, and the brutality of the attack was unlike anything investigators had seen before. Just days later, Annie Chapman was found murdered behind a lodging house on Hanbury Street, her body mutilated in a way that suggested a killer growing more confident, more skilled, and far more dangerous. By late September, the fear in Whitechapel had reached its peak. 2 murders occurred on the same night: Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. Stride's body, found on Berner Street, bore a deep slash across her throat, but none of the mutilations seen in the earlier killings, leading many to believe the Ripper may have been interrupted mid-attack. Less than an hour later, Eddowes was found in Mitre Square, and this time, the full horror returned. Her body was brutally mutilated, organs removed with disturbing precision. Investigators believe the killer possessed anatomical knowledge, suggesting he could have been a butcher, a doctor, or someone skilled with knives. By November 9th, the terror reached its horrific peak with the murder of Mary Jane Kelly in Miller's Court. Unlike the others, Kelly was killed indoors, giving the killer time, and the result was the most grotesque mutilation of them all. The newspapers seized upon the chaos, transforming the murders into a media sensation. Headlines screamed of the Whitechapel Fiend, and gruesome sketches of the crime scenes captivated readers. As panic spread, the killer himself, or perhaps a cruel prankster, seemed to join the spectacle. Letters began arriving at news agencies and police stations signed Jack the Ripper. The most infamous of these, the Dear Boss letter, taunted investigators and promised further bloodshed. Whether authentic or not, the letter created a name that would endure for more than a century, cementing the killer's place in history. Police efforts to catch the murderer were relentless but ultimately frustrating. Inspector Frederick Aberline and his team questioned hundreds of suspects, scoured lodging houses, and patrolled the streets night after night. But forensic science in the 19th century was primitive, and without modern tools like DNA analysis, investigators had little to work with beyond eyewitness accounts and circumstantial evidence. Suspects ranged from local butchers to medical students, asylum patients, and foreign immigrants. Yet the deeper they looked, the murkier the case became, and the killer always seemed one step ahead. For over a century, the mystery of Jack the Ripper's identity has inspired countless theories. Some pointed to wealthy aristocrats, others to members of the royal family, and still others to obscure figures like artists or doctors who quietly disappeared after the killings. But in recent years, a breakthrough sparked fresh debate. A shawl, said to have been found near Catherine Eddowes' body, was tested using modern mitochondrial DNA techniques. Researchers compared genetic material on the fabric to living descendants of both Eddowes and one longtime suspect, Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber who lived in Whitechapel during the murders and was already on police radar at the time. The tests revealed a strong match. leading some experts to declare Kosminski the most likely culprit. The claim set off a firestorm of controversy. Supporters hailed it as the closest thing to a solution the case had ever seen, while critics were quick to point out flaws. Mitochondrial DNA cannot pinpoint a single individual. It can only narrow results to a group of people who share maternal ancestry. Furthermore, doubts about the shawl's authenticity remain. There is no official record proving it was ever at the crime scene, and its chain of custody over the decades is questionable. Some argue that the DNA could have been contaminated long after the murders took place. Despite these issues, the findings reignited global fascination and breathed new life into a case many assumed would remain unsolved forever. The renewed attention also highlights deeper questions that go beyond the search for a name. Jack the Ripper's killings were not just about brutality. They revealed the desperation, inequality, and neglect that defined Victorian London. The murders targeted some of society's most vulnerable women, those struggling to survive in an unforgiving environment where poverty and danger walked hand in hand. The failure of authorities to protect these women and the exploitation of their deaths by sensationalist media reflected a broader societal collapse, one where class, gender, and survival were tragically intertwined. As we revisit this haunting chapter of history, it's impossible not to recognize why the Ripper continues to grip the public imagination. The crimes were shocking, but it's the mystery that endures, the idea that, even with modern science and relentless investigation, the true identity of the killer remains just out of reach. Forensic advances like DNA testing bring us closer, but unanswered questions keep the legend alive. Was Aaron Kosminski truly the killer? Or is the truth still buried somewhere beneath the fog of Whitechapel's past? For now, the Ripper remains a phantom, stalking not the alleys of London, but the dark corners of history itself. By late September 1888, the streets of Whitechapel had transformed into something unrecognizable. Fear was no longer an undercurrent. It was a presence that clung to every doorway and alley, heavy in the damp London air. The Ripper had struck multiple times, each attack escalating in brutality, and the city seemed to tremble under the weight of the unknown. The working-class district, already steeped in hardship, became a pressure cooker of paranoia, tension, and suspicion. The people knew now that they were living alongside a predator, a figure capable of vanishing into the fog moments after committing horrors beyond comprehension. Scotland Yard had thrown nearly everything it had into the investigation. Detectives combed through darkened streets, questioned lodging housekeepers, and rounded up anyone even loosely connected to the murders. Inspector Frederick Aberline, one of the lead investigators, walked the crime scenes himself, retracing the Ripper's steps, studying the angles, the mutilations, the timing of each attack. The investigation was chaotic but relentless, with hundreds of interviews conducted and dozens of suspects questioned. Yet for every clue uncovered, more questions emerged, and the killer seemed always one step ahead, almost as though he could sense where the police would search next. The public, meanwhile, demanded answers. The newspapers fanned the flames of hysteria, publishing lurid headlines and gory details that kept readers hooked. Every new killing, every letter claiming to be from the killer, was sensationalized to an extraordinary degree. The press painted Whitechapel as a place of evil and ruin, further stigmatizing an area already synonymous with poverty and desperation. And then, on September 27th, the Central News Agency received a letter that would define the case forever. It began with a chilling salutation. "Dear Boss." The author boasted of the murders and mocked the police's failure to catch him, signing the note with a name that would become infamous worldwide, Jack the Ripper. Whether the letter came from the killer himself or an opportunistic hoaxer remains debated to this day. But for the terrified residents of Whitechapel, the effect was immediate and devastating. The name Jack the Ripper spread like wildfire, cementing the figure of a faceless monster in the public imagination. People began seeing the Ripper in every shadow, suspecting neighbors, strangers, even friends. Anyone who carried a medical bag, a sharp knife, or simply walked the streets alone at night risked being accused. The police were desperate, but the investigation faced constant setbacks. The limited forensic tools of the era left detectives heavily reliant on eyewitness statements, and those proved unreliable at best. Witnesses gave conflicting descriptions. Some swore the killer was clean-shaven and neatly dressed, while others claimed he was disheveled, foreign, and possibly insane. Some said he had the air of a surgeon, others that he looked like a dockworker. No two accounts aligned, creating an endless cycle of false leads and wasted efforts. Amid the chaos, one discovery threatened to plunge the already tense city into complete unrest. After the murder of Catherine Eddowes on September 30th, a piece of her blood-stained apron was found in Golston Street. Above it, scrawled in chalk on a nearby wall, was a cryptic message. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The strange wording in reference to Jews, interpreted by many as Jews, sparked immediate fears of anti-Semitic violence. Whitechapel had a large immigrant population, many of them Jewish, and tensions between communities were already high. Authorities, fearing riots, quickly ordered the message erased before it could be photographed or properly documented. Some argued this decision destroyed a key piece of evidence, one of the many controversial choices made during the investigation. Suspects multiplied rapidly. Among the earliest was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish immigrant living in Whitechapel. He was known to suffer from severe mental illness and had exhibited violent tendencies, making him a compelling figure for investigators. Yet at the time, there was little solid evidence to connect him to the murders, and he was eventually committed to an asylum without formal charges. Others pointed to Montague John Druitt, a well-educated barrister who died by suicide shortly after the final canonical murder. Some detectives privately believed his death marked the end of the killings, suggesting guilt, but no concrete evidence linked him to the crimes. Then there was Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born con man and suspected lunatic, Francis Tumblety, a wealthy American doctor, who collected uteruses in jars and fled England under suspicion, and even Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria, whose rumored connections to scandal made him a favorite target for conspiracy theorists. With every passing week, new names were added, but none brought investigators closer to the truth. Behind the scenes, tensions within Scotland Yard boiled over. Officers clashed over strategies and suspects, and public criticism intensified. The Ripper case had become a national obsession, dominating headlines and parliamentary debates. Some accused the police of incompetence, while others believed they were withholding the killer's identity to protect someone powerful. The idea of a cover-up, though never proven, became a persistent undercurrent in Ripper lore. Adding to the chaos were the letters. Hundreds of them arrived at police stations and newspapers, each claiming to be from the killer. Some were crude jokes, while others displayed intimate knowledge of the crimes that kept investigators guessing. Among the most infamous was the "From Hell" letter, sent along with a gruesome package containing half a human kidney, allegedly taken from one of the victims. Experts at the time debated its authenticity, and the debate continues to this day. While many believe most of the letters were hoaxes designed to exploit public panic, they deepened the sense that the killer was mocking authorities and thriving on the chaos he created. By the end of 1888, fear consumed Whitechapel entirely. Lodging house owners posted curfews, and patrols formed to escort women home at night. Yet despite the community's efforts to protect itself, the killings highlighted just how vulnerable many of the district's residents truly were. Most of the Ripper's victims were women living on the edge of survival, forced by poverty into dangerous circumstances. For them, danger was not limited to a single predator. Their daily existence was a constant battle against hunger, homelessness, and violence. The Ripper exploited this vulnerability, moving through streets where anonymity came easily and desperation silenced questions. In modern times, forensic science has attempted to revisit the case and provide answers where 19th-century tools failed. Advanced DNA testing, geographic profiling, and behavioral analysis have all been applied to the Ripper's crimes, and while these techniques have narrowed the list of likely suspects, they have yet to deliver an undeniable conclusion. The name Aaron Kosminski resurfaces often, especially after the DNA analysis conducted on the alleged shawl linked to Catherine Eddowes, but controversy continues to cloud those findings. With each revelation comes a counterargument, and the mystery refuses to let itself be solved. The enduring fascination with Jack the Ripper is not only about the murders but also about what they represent: a collision of class, poverty, power, and fear in Victorian London. The killings revealed the fractures in society, exposing the plight of women in Whitechapel and the inability of institutions to protect its most vulnerable. The Ripper was not just a killer. He was a symbol of chaos in a city struggling to hold itself together. Even now, more than a century later, the case captures imaginations worldwide. Researchers, historians, and enthusiasts continue to pore over police reports, witness statements, and grainy photographs, each hoping to find the missing piece that will finally unmask the killer. But with time erasing evidence and memory alike, the truth remains elusive. For every theory, there is a contradiction. For every suspect, there is doubt. And so the phantom of Whitechapel continues to haunt the fog-draped streets of history, his identity as shadowed and uncertain as the night in which he prowled. By late October 1888, London was drowning in fear, rumor, and suspicion. The Ripper murders had transformed Whitechapel from a poor, struggling district into the epicenter of international horror. With 5 canonical victims now attributed to the killer, the city teetered between desperation and chaos. Police patrols multiplied, newspapers printed sensational headlines daily. And yet the predator who stalked the alleys of East London seemed untouchable, vanishing into the fog as though the labyrinthine streets belonged to him alone. The authorities found themselves trapped between public fury and investigative dead ends. Scotland Yard assigned more detectives to the case than ever before, with Chief Inspector Donald Swanson overseeing operations under the leadership of Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson. Inspector Frederick Aberline, who had earned a reputation for his tireless work on Whitechapel's streets, spent night after night retracing the Ripper's path, searching for patterns that might finally expose him. But the clues, when they appeared at all, dissolved into contradictions. Eyewitness statements clashed, physical evidence was scarce, and London's underbelly, a sprawl of lodging houses, dark courtyards, and hidden passages, gave the killer infinite places to disappear. Newspapers, sensing the hysteria and capitalizing on it, churned out speculation as fast as the presses could print. The Dear Boss letter had already introduced the name Jack the Ripper to the public, but more letters kept arriving by the dozens. One of the most infamous, the Saucy Jackie postcard, bragged about a double event, the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the same night, and seemed to contain details not publicly released. Investigators debated its authenticity, but when that from hell letter arrived with half of a preserved human kidney, allegedly taken from one of the victims, the city spiraled further into panic. Genuine or not, the letters achieved their goal. They deepened the terror and humiliated the police. Amid the growing chaos, suspicion spread like wildfire. Anyone with a sharp knife, medical training, or foreign accent drew whispers. Hundreds of suspects were named, questioned, and dismissed, but a handful stood out, men whose presence in Whitechapel at the time, combined with their backgrounds, made them figures of enduring fascination even to this day. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant, was one such suspect. A mentally ill man with documented episodes of violent behavior, Kosminski lived in the heart of Whitechapel and matched several witness accounts. Years later, Assistant Commissioner Anderson would name him as the prime suspect in his memoirs, claiming the case had effectively been solved but that no prosecution was possible. Still, at the time, the evidence was circumstantial, and Kosminski was quietly committed to an asylum without facing formal charges. Decades later, forensic scientists would revisit him as part of modern DNA testing, bringing his name back into the spotlight, though the results remained disputed among experts. Another leading suspect was Montague John Druitt, a well-educated barrister and schoolteacher whose life unraveled in the months leading up to the murders. When his body was pulled from the River Thames in December 1888, some investigators believed his death coincided suspiciously with the end of the canonical killings. Druitt's family history, troubled mental health, and sudden suicide made him an enduring candidate for Ripper theories, though, like Kosminski, no definitive evidence tied him to the crimes. Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born conman and thief, also drew early attention. He was known to be violent and had medical knowledge, making him a possible fit. Then there was Francis Tumblety, a wealthy and eccentric American doctor who collected preserved human organs, specifically uteruses, and fled the country just as suspicion mounted against him. He would later resurface in the United States, living freely, while Scotland Yard remained divided over his potential involvement. And then there was James Maybrick, a wealthy cotton merchant from Liverpool, whose name would not enter Ripper discussions until a century later, when a mysterious diary surfaced claiming his guilt. The so-called Maybrick Diary, filled with chilling confessions, reignited global fascination in the 1990s, but experts remain deeply divided on its authenticity. Whether a genuine artifact or an elaborate hoax, it illustrates just how far the case's shadow stretches, across time, continents, and imagination. As the suspect list ballooned, the failures of the police became increasingly public. Detectives from Scotland Yard and the Metropolitan Police clashed with the City of London Police over jurisdiction and theories, creating inefficiency and confusion. Rival officers withheld information from one another, and potential leads were lost in the case. To make matters worse, new murders across Whitechapel, some eerily similar to the Ripper's methods, clouded the investigation. Were they copycats, or had the killer evolved? Each unanswered question chipped away at public trust. Outside the investigative offices, Whitechapel was suffocating under the weight of fear and poverty. Women avoided the streets after dark unless desperation forced them into danger. Lodging houses filled beyond capacity, forcing many to sleep in alleys or stairwells. The killings had exposed the brutal inequalities of London, where entire communities lived on the margins, unprotected and unheard. Reformers began to speak out, using the Ripper case as a grim illustration of systemic neglect, a city too divided by class to care for its most vulnerable, until violence forced it into the headlines. Modern researchers have since revisited these same tensions, merging forensic science with historical analysis in an attempt to solve what 19th-century investigators could not. In 2019, a controversial DNA study claimed that material recovered from a shawl belonging to victim Catherine Eddowes matched descendants of Aaron Kosminski's family. While some hailed this as a breakthrough, others criticized the methodology and contamination risks, keeping the debate unresolved. Geographic profiling, a modern technique used to map the likely home base of serial offenders, has also been applied to the Ripper case, suggesting the killer lived within a tight radius of the crime scenes, possibly operating from a lodging house or hidden room in Whitechapel itself. Beyond forensic science, psychological profiling has reshaped theories about the Ripper's identity. Modern profilers describe a killer likely operating with deep-seated sexual rage, choosing victims who represented vulnerability and anonymity rather than personal connection. Others believe the killer may have had medical training, given the precision of certain mutilations, while skeptics argue the techniques used could just as easily have been learned from butchering animals, common work among East End laborers at the time. Still, despite technological advances and more than a century of scrutiny, no definitive answer has emerged. Each new discovery seems to generate as many questions as it answers. Perhaps that is part of what makes the Jack the Ripper case endure, its perfect balance of detail and mystery. There is just enough evidence to fuel theories forever, and just enough uncertainty to ensure none can ever be confirmed. In Whitechapel, the echoes of 1888 remain. Tourists walk the same narrow lanes where the Ripper hunted, lanternlit tours tracing steps that investigators once scoured by gaslight. Historians pore over fragile police records, crime scene sketches, and faded testimonies, reconstructing the final hours of lives cut short in hopes of understanding the man behind the shadow. For locals, the Ripper is not just a legend but a reminder of how fragile safety can be when society abandons its poorest to the darkness. And yet, there is something enduringly unsettling about knowing that Jack the Ripper might have simply walked away, melting back into the crowd, his name unknown, his secrets buried. Whether he died shortly after the killings, moved elsewhere to begin again, or was confined quietly to an asylum, one haunting truth remains: London never caught him. More than 130 years later, his shadow lingers over the fog-choked streets of history, refusing to fade. By November 1888, the streets of Whitechapel had grown unnervingly quiet, but the silence brought no comfort. London's East End remained shrouded in unease, and while the Ripper's blade had seemingly gone still, his presence lingered in every shadow. People walked faster at night, doors were bolted earlier, and conversations carried whispers of suspicion. The terror was not only in the crimes themselves but in the uncertainty. No one knew when, or if, he would strike again. For Scotland Yard, the pressure had reached its breaking point. Months of relentless investigation had yielded nothing definitive, and public outrage over the police's failure was growing louder by the day. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, one of the lead investigators on the ground, was working tirelessly, but frustration was mounting inside the ranks. Information was being lost in a maze of bureaucratic rivalry between Scotland Yard, the City of London Police, and local divisions. It was not just one investigation, it was several, each with its own theories, files, and failures, and no one truly in command. The newspapers, hungry for sales and notoriety, amplified every mistake. Editorials condemned Scotland Yard as incompetent, and artists produced lurid illustrations depicting shadowy figures lurking in fog-filled alleys. Headlines screamed of London's shame and demanded resignations from top officials. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly on November 9th, the Ripper's most savage and gruesome killing, had left even hardened investigators shaken. Her mutilation was far more extreme than that of the previous victims, suggesting either a killer emboldened by his success or one spiraling out of control. Mary Jane Kelly's murder marked what many historians now call the final confirmed attack by the Ripper, yet for weeks afterward, police anticipated another strike. Officers flooded the streets at night, informants were paid to gather whispers from pubs and lodging houses, and every suspicious man seemed to be dragged into questioning. But as the weeks turned into months without another killing, uncertainty deepened. Had the killer died? Had he fled London? Or was he still there, watching as chaos erupted around him? Behind closed doors, Scotland Yard maintained a growing list of potential suspects, and these files became increasingly secretive as failures mounted. Aaron Kosminski's name had quietly circulated among the ranks, particularly after a witness identified him during a police lineup, though the witness later refused to testify publicly, reportedly fearing retaliation within his own community. Despite internal suspicions, the authorities never released Kosminski's name at the time, partly out of fear of stoking anti-Semitic violence in Whitechapel, where tensions between locals and immigrant populations were already high. Montague John Druitt's case file also resurfaced during this period, drawing fresh scrutiny after his suicide in December 1888. Some detectives were convinced Druitt's death explained the sudden end of the killings, but others argued it was coincidence. In truth, Scotland Yard lacked evidence tying him directly to the crimes, and speculation became the closest thing to resolution. Meanwhile, other names floated in and out of focus: Michael Ostrog, George Chapman, and even high-profile figures like Sir William Gull, physician to the royal family, whose inclusion in conspiracy theories decades later would fuel endless speculation about cover-ups and secrets buried within the upper class. Newly uncovered documents from Scotland Yard archives, made public in recent years, have shed light on the mounting desperation within the investigation. Internal memos reveal that officials feared social unrest as much as they feared the killer himself. Whitechapel's working-class residents were growing increasingly hostile toward authorities, convinced that the police had no interest in protecting the poor. There were violent confrontations in the streets, and even rumors of organized mobs preparing to take justice into their own hands. Amidst this chaos, letters continued to pour into Scotland Yard from individuals claiming to be Jack the Ripper. While the infamous "Dear Boss" and "From Hell" letters dominated headlines, hundreds more flooded in, ranging from crude hoaxes to disturbing messages describing intimate details of the murders. Investigators suspected that some came from journalists eager to boost circulation, while others may have come from opportunistic pranksters exploiting fear for amusement. The result was confusion and wasted manpower, time spent chasing taunts while the real killer slipped further into obscurity. The frustration was compounded by the sheer environmental difficulty of policing Whitechapel. narrow alleyways twisted into one another like a maze, many unlit and shrouded in perpetual fog from nearby factories. Countless lodging houses provided cheap beds for strangers who came and went nightly without record, and the transient nature of the population made witness accounts unreliable. Residents feared involvement, and even when potential leads emerged, they dissolved into contradictions or dead ends. Scotland Yard was fighting a phantom in a city built to conceal him. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the mystery of Jack the Ripper became something larger than a crime spree. It transformed into a cultural phenomenon. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, books were written, plays were staged, and public lectures dissected every detail of the case. People across the world debated his identity, piecing together fragments of evidence into elaborate theories. Within decades, Jack the Ripper was no longer just a criminal. He had become a symbol of urban fear, class struggle, and the dark underbelly of industrial progress. Modern researchers, however, continue to revisit the case with fresh tools. Advances in forensic science have reopened old wounds and provided tantalizing hints of answers once thought impossible. In 2019, DNA analysis conducted on a shawl believed to belong to Catherine et al.'s linked genetic material to descendants of Aaron Kosminski's family line. While hailed by some as the closest confirmation yet, the study sparked heated debate within the scientific community. Critics questioned whether the shawl had been properly preserved and whether contamination across decades could render the findings unreliable. Forensic breakthroughs remain controversial, but they have breathed new life into the investigation, forcing experts to reconsider long-dismissed suspects. More recently, geographic profiling, a technique widely used today in active investigations, has been applied to the Ripper murders. By analyzing the locations of the canonical 5 killings, researchers have narrowed the likely comfort zone where the killer may have lived or operated. Surprisingly, the data suggests that Jack the Ripper was likely a local, living within walking distance of the murder scenes, possibly blending seamlessly into the community he terrorized. This reinforces theories that the killer may have been hiding in plain sight all along, passing unnoticed in crowded lodging houses or working mundane jobs by day while hunting at night. Other modern psychological profiles suggest the Ripper was not a medical professional, as long believed, but rather someone with practical knowledge of cutting, perhaps a butcher or slaughterhouse worker. Such theories gain weight when viewed alongside Whitechapel's industrial landscape, where countless men work daily in environments requiring precision with knives. This would explain the nature of the mutilations without attributing them to advanced surgical skill, shifting suspicion away from wealthy doctors and toward working-class laborers who blended invisibly into the streets. The absence of closure has given the case its strange endurance. Unlike most historical crimes, where time dulls memory and mystery fades, Jack the Ripper remains an open wound, a story that demands resolution yet resists it at every turn. Each new discovery, whether archival or forensic, deepens the intrigue but rarely provides definitive answers. London has transformed beyond recognition since 1888, yet the specter of the Ripper still clings to its cobbled alleys and dim gaslights, casting a shadow that refuses to lift. Whitechapel itself has become part of the legend. Tourists still walk the paths once haunted by terror, following the trails of Mary and Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. The same narrow passages and hidden courtyards remain, living remnants of a city whose secrets have never fully surfaced. Scholars, amateur sleuths, and forensic specialists continue to revisit dusty archives, hoping the final missing piece is hidden among the forgotten pages of police reports or locked away in private collections. Even with modern breakthroughs, the truth remains elusive. The killer's identity lies somewhere between evidence and speculation, a balance that has kept the world captivated for over a century. It is this tension, between fact and myth, between fear and fascination, that ensures Jack the Ripper's name will endure, whispered into the shadows where history and mystery collide. As 1889 arrived, the terror that had gripped Whitechapel seemed to have eased, yet London remained restless. For months, the killings attributed to Jack the Ripper had ceased, but the quiet did not bring relief. Instead, it birthed unease and speculation. People whispered that the killer had fled, died, or been secretly captured by authorities who dared not admit their failures. Scotland Yard, meanwhile, found itself trapped in a web of unanswered questions and public anger, caught between mounting political pressures and the embarrassment of leaving the city vulnerable to terror. Though the 5 canonical murders had ended, the Ripper's shadow still haunted the East End. Newspapers, which had profited immensely from the hysteria, continued to publish stories suggesting new sightings, cryptic letters, and alleged confessions. Some papers sensationalized false claims simply to fuel circulation, leaving the public confused and distrustful of the authorities. Scotland Yard, now heavily criticized for its inability to solve the case, struggled to balance damage control with genuine investigative work. Behind closed doors, files were quietly compiled on dozens of suspects, many of whom have become infamous today, but few leads reached the public. One of the most mysterious developments of this period was the destruction of key pieces of evidence in the years that followed. Internal memos discovered in Scotland Yard archives decades later revealed that certain police files had been weeded out or discarded in the early 20th century. No official reason was given, though some historians believe the files were destroyed to protect reputations, possibly of suspects from prominent families or those with political connections. Others argue that routine administrative purges simply wiped away irreplaceable materials without malice. Regardless of intent, the result was catastrophic. Vital witness statements, investigative notes, and physical evidence that could have clarified the killer's identity were lost forever. During the early 1890s, Scotland Yard still received letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper. Most were crude hoaxes, but some stood out for their unsettling tone and apparent knowledge of details not widely reported. Among the most disturbing were communications linking the Ripper's supposed escape from London to planned killings abroad. While none of these claims were verified, police quietly collaborated with other European agencies, fearing the killer had migrated to cities like Paris, Hamburg, or New York. Historical records show an unusual uptick in violent assaults on women in these regions during the early 1890s, though no solid evidence has tied them directly to the Whitechapel murders. One name that increasingly dominated private discussions among investigators was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant living in Whitechapel. By the early 1890s, police reports describe him as a mentally unstable man who had been institutionalized after a series of breakdowns. A police lineup reportedly placed him near the scene of one of the murders, but the witness who identified him refused to testify, fearing community backlash and potential violence. This refusal, coupled with insufficient evidence, prevented the police from pursuing charges. Kosminski lived out the rest of his life in an asylum, where he died in 1919, never publicly connected to the crimes. For decades, Kosminski's name remained buried in confidential reports until modern historians unearthed them. In recent years, forensic developments have reignited debates about his role. A 2019 DNA analysis conducted on a shawl believed to have belonged to Catherine et al.'s matched mitochondrial DNA to living descendants of Kosminski's family line. The findings electrified the true crime community, seemingly confirming what some detectives suspected in 1888. However, skeptics argue that the shawl's chain of custody was unreliable and that contamination over more than a century could compromise the results. This tension between historical records and modern science mirrors the broader struggle of the case. The facts never seem to settle into certainty. Montague John Druitt, another figure under intense scrutiny, continued to fascinate investigators even after his death in December 1888. Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher, drowned in the Thames shortly after the final canonical murder. An internal memorandum written by Chief Constable Melville Macnaghten in 1894 claimed that Druitt was strongly suspected of being the killer and suggested his suicide explained why the murders abruptly stopped. While compelling on the surface, Druitt's profile raised contradictions. He came from a respectable family, lacked known ties to Whitechapel, and had no documented history of violence. Some experts believe Druitt was a convenient scapegoat, a suspect who could be quietly named within private police files without generating public backlash. At the same time, new theories were emerging about the possibility of multiple killers or accomplices. Some investigators believe the differences between the murder scenes suggested at least two individuals were involved, perhaps working independently but sharing similar targets. The murder of Elizabeth Stride, for example, appeared less brutal than the others, leading some to theorize her killer was interrupted, or that she may not have been a Ripper victim at all. Yet this theory remains hotly debated even today, with modern researchers split between viewing the canonical 5 murders as the work of a single individual, or a convergence of separate crimes committed within the same area and time frame. The unresolved nature of the investigation opened the door for far more elaborate and controversial theories. Among the most enduring are those involving royal conspiracies, Freemason cover-ups, and hidden political scandals. In one of the most sensational claims, the so-called royal conspiracy theory alleged that the murders were orchestrated to cover up an affair between Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, and a young woman tied to Whitechapel's working class. According to proponents, several murders were carried out to silence witnesses. Critics, however, argue that there is no credible evidence to support these claims, and most historians regard them as products of 20th century sensationalism rather than 19th century reality. Adding to the confusion was the extraordinary influence of the press. Newspapers were locked in a vicious competition for readership, publishing speculative claims as fact and framing theories in ways that deepened public fear. Some reports claimed Scotland Yard had already identified the killer and was concealing the truth to avoid riots. Others accused local immigrants of harboring the murderer, worsening racial and cultural tensions in Whitechapel. Crowds gathered nightly outside police stations demanding justice, and mobs occasionally formed, threatening anyone accused of resembling published descriptions of the Ripper. The police, trapped between rising social unrest and political demands from Parliament, intensified their surveillance of Whitechapel's lodging houses, pubs, and brothels. Special constables were brought in to supplement local forces, but their presence sometimes made matters worse, alienating residents who viewed the authorities as outsiders policing an already oppressed community. In an effort to demonstrate progress, Scotland Yard publicly released composite sketches based on witness descriptions, but these were contradictory and vague. Witness reliability became one of the investigation's greatest challenges, with statements frequently conflicting and many potential leads collapsing under scrutiny. Recently unearthed correspondence from internal police archives paints a picture of investigators overwhelmed by the pressure. Several officers expressed doubts that the killer would ever be caught, noting that Whitechapel's geography, population density, and chaotic living conditions made tracking suspects nearly impossible. One inspector wrote privately that the Ripper could vanish as easily as the fog, and the sentiment resonates even today when reviewing the fractured state of the investigation. Modern criminologists revisiting the case have also applied geographic profiling and behavioral analysis, tools unavailable in the 19th century, to reconstruct potential suspect zones. These studies suggest the killer likely lived within walking distance of the crime scenes and was intimately familiar with Whitechapel's narrow alleys and escape routes. Rather than an outsider stalking the district, this theory paints the Ripper as a local resident, someone the community may have passed daily without suspicion. Despite these developments, the unanswered questions remain endless. Why did the killing stop so suddenly? Was the Ripper institutionalized, imprisoned for an unrelated crime, or dead by the end of 1888? Were the 5 canonical victims his only ones? Or do earlier unsolved murders across London hold overlooked connections? New investigations continue to explore these possibilities, analyzing Victorian police records alongside modern forensic advances, yet the truth remains just out of reach. Over 130 years later, Jack the Ripper endures not only because of the brutality of his crimes but because of the intricate maze of conflicting accounts, lost evidence, and unrelenting speculation. Each new discovery, whether from archived police files or advanced forensic studies, seems to bring us closer to clarity, only to reveal deeper contradictions beneath the surface. Whitechapel's fog may have long lifted, but the shadows of 1888 remain. By the early 20th century, the Ripper murders had taken on a life of their own, evolving from a terrifying unsolved crime spree into one of history's most enduring mysteries. Even as Whitechapel transformed, slums replaced by new housing, narrow alleys widened, and populations shifting, the shadow of 1888 lingered. For those who had lived through the fear, the silence following the canonical murders remained haunting, and for new generations, the unanswered questions became an obsession. The case was more than a criminal investigation now. It had become a cultural phenomenon, a puzzle that neither time nor progress seemed capable of solving. In the years after the final murder, Scotland Yard faced an uncomfortable reality. They had failed. Despite deploying hundreds of officers, interviewing thousands of witnesses, and compiling stacks of investigative notes, they never identified the killer with certainty. This failure wasn't just a blow to law enforcement. It left space for the public, the press, and private investigators to shape the narrative however they wished. And so, theories began multiplying, each more elaborate than the last, creating a labyrinth of speculation that still fascinates researchers today. As historians gained access to police archives decades later, they discovered troubling indications that some of the most important materials had been deliberately removed. Witness statements went missing, private memos were destroyed, and photographs of critical evidence simply vanished. One of the most significant pieces believed to have been lost is a blood-stained apron belonging to Catherine Eddowes, which some claimed bore the killer's DNA. Others insist it was never properly preserved, and its chain of custody was broken long before forensic science had evolved enough to test it. The destruction of such artifacts has fueled suspicions that the police, or influential figures tied to suspects, may have intentionally obscured the truth. Among the theories that gained traction was the idea that Jack the Ripper may not have acted alone. While the canonical 5 murders share disturbing similarities, subtle differences in wounds, timing, and locations have led some researchers to conclude that more than one individual could have been involved. Elizabeth Stride's killing, for example, has long divided experts. Her injuries were less severe compared to other victims, suggesting either an interrupted attack or a different perpetrator altogether. Could a copycat killer have emerged in the chaos? Was there an accomplice shadowing the Ripper's movements? Without definitive forensic evidence, the debate remains unsettled. This uncertainty has kept dozens of potential suspects in the spotlight for more than a century. Among them is Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born conman and thief who spent much of his life in and out of prison. Some Scotland Yard officials privately suspected him of the murders, believing his violent tendencies and erratic movements matched the killer's profile. However, later research revealed that Ostrog was incarcerated during several of the canonical killings, casting doubt on his involvement. Still, his name remains entangled in the narrative, emblematic of just how far suspicion spread during those chaotic years. Another enduring suspect is Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, a Scottish-born physician later executed in 1892 for poisoning multiple victims in London. Cream was imprisoned in Illinois during the Ripper killings, leading most historians to dismiss him. Yet some conspiracy theorists cling to an infamous claim that, upon his hanging, Cream's last words were allegedly, "I am Jack the," cut short as the trapdoor opened. Though likely apocryphal, the story persists, illustrating how deeply the case had infiltrated the public imagination, blurring the line between fact and myth. But perhaps the most intriguing recent development revolves around Aaron Kosminski, whose name reemerged in the 21st century due to advancements in forensic DNA testing. The shawl allegedly linked to Catherine Eddowes' murder has remained at the center of this debate. When researchers announced in 2019 that mitochondrial DNA from the shawl matched a living relative of Kosminski, many hailed it as the final answer. For a moment, the world believed the Ripper had finally been unmasked. However, the revelation sparked as much controversy as clarity. Critics argue that the shawl's provenance is questionable, pointing out that it had been handled by countless people over more than a century and stored improperly, leaving it vulnerable to contamination. Without an unbroken chain of custody, skeptics caution against accepting the findings as definitive proof. While Kosminski remains a leading suspect, another figure has gained renewed attention: Montague John Druitt. Decades after his death, newly discovered writings revealed just how seriously Scotland Yard had considered him. In particular, Chief Constable Melville Macnaghten's confidential 1894 memorandum painted Druitt as sexually insane, and suggested that his suicide shortly after Mary Jane Kelly's murder may explain the sudden cessation of killings. Yet the lack of direct evidence, combined with Druitt's respectable background, leaves his involvement shrouded in ambiguity. Druitt embodies one of the case's enduring contradictions, a suspect both plausible and improbable, depending entirely on which fragments of information survive. In recent years, modern criminology has breathed new life into the investigation, applying behavioral profiling, digital mapping, and geographic analysis to reconstruct patterns the original detectives couldn't see. Using sophisticated software, experts have narrowed probable comfort zones where the killer might have lived, theorizing that the Ripper likely resided within a short walking distance of all 5 canonical murder scenes. One area, centered around Flower and Dean Street, a notorious lodging district in Whitechapel, emerges repeatedly in these reconstructions. Historical records confirm that Kosminski and several other prominent suspects lived within this vicinity, lending weight to theories that the killer was deeply embedded within the very community he terrorized. The psychological profile of the Ripper has also evolved significantly. Early Victorian detectives viewed him through the lens of moral depravity, assuming his violence was rooted in sadism or sheer madness. Today, modern profilers consider broader possibilities, including compulsive behavior, trauma, and environmental stressors. The Ripper's ability to strike with precision, evade capture, and seemingly vanish into the chaos of Whitechapel suggests a killer who was both opportunistic and highly familiar with the district's geography. Far from the deranged madman painted in sensational headlines, he may have been calculating, blending seamlessly into the rhythms of daily life. Yet, even as technology advances, the passage of time creates barriers no science can overcome. Much of the physical evidence from 1888 was never properly catalogued, let alone preserved. Countless objects were discarded or lost, and the streets themselves have changed so dramatically that reconstructing events often relies on incomplete maps and descriptions. Witness testimony, already fragile under the chaos and fear of the time, has degraded further under reinterpretation. Every new theory must contend with a century of distortions layered atop the original tragedy. Adding to the case's enduring fascination is its impact on London's social and political landscape. The Ripper murders exposed the deep divides between the wealthy West End and the impoverished East End, sparking outrage over living conditions in Whitechapel. Many historians believe the government's failure to address these disparities played a role in how quickly panic spread. For the working-class residents, the lack of protection became symbolic of broader neglect by those in power. Some researchers argue this context is critical for understanding the Ripper's legacy. His identity remains elusive, but his actions forced Victorian society to confront systemic inequalities it had long ignored. Despite more than 130 years of analysis, no theory has achieved universal acceptance. Each piece of evidence seems to solve one mystery only to unravel another. Did Scotland Yard secretly identify the killer and cover it up to avoid scandal? Was the Ripper arrested for unrelated crimes and quietly removed from public life? Did he leave London entirely, leaving his legacy behind while continuing elsewhere undetected? With so many conflicting accounts and the irreversible loss of key materials, absolute certainty may be beyond reach. What makes this case endure isn't just the brutality of the murders, but the gaps, the empty spaces in which speculation thrives. Every advancement, from modern DNA techniques to behavioral modeling, brings us closer to understanding the world the Ripper inhabited, yet his shadow remains unbroken. And as each new revelation emerges, the mystery deepens, capturing the imagination of generations who still search for the face behind the fog. By the mid-20th century, the Whitechapel murders had shifted from being an unresolved criminal investigation into a phenomenon that transcended history. While the fear and chaos of 1888 had long faded, fascination with the Ripper only deepened with each passing decade. Newspapers, books, films, and documentaries began to reinterpret the case for new audiences, shaping public perception and rewriting the narrative as fresh theories surfaced. What began as a series of brutal killings confined to a handful of East London streets had evolved into a global mystery, capturing imaginations far beyond the alleys of Whitechapel. The enduring intrigue can be traced to three central forces: the shocking brutality of the crimes, the enigmatic identity of the killer, and the culture of secrecy surrounding the investigation. Each of these elements combined to create fertile ground for myth-making. The Victorian press played a pivotal role from the start, sensationalizing every new detail and giving the Ripper a presence larger than life. Graphic illustrations, lurid headlines, and even fabricated eyewitness statements sold newspapers by the thousands, and in the process, they transformed the unknown killer into an enduring cultural figure. Over time, these exaggerations bled into fact, making it increasingly difficult to separate reality from legend. By the early 1900s, private investigators, amateur sleuths, and writers began to reconstruct the events of 1888 using whatever scraps of information they could find. Some approached the case with genuine curiosity, others saw opportunities for fame or profit. This mixture of motives created competing theories that rarely aligned. Was the Ripper a local man who blended seamlessly into the chaos of Whitechapel, or an outsider drawn to its anonymity? Was he a doctor, a butcher, a sailor, or a member of the aristocracy? Each new possibility reshaped the narrative, but none resolved it. As decades passed, certain suspects rose to prominence. Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, became one of the most controversial names linked to the case. His rumored connections to brothels, coupled with his alleged mental instability, fed conspiracies that the royal family orchestrated a cover-up to protect him. Many historians dismiss these claims as sensationalism, but they left a lasting mark on popular culture. Films, novels, and even stage productions leaned heavily on this theory, turning the Ripper from an unknown figure into a possible instrument of political intrigue. The mid-20th century also saw advancements in forensic science, sparking renewed hope that the mystery could finally be solved. However, investigators quickly discovered the limitations of working with evidence more than half a century old. Key artifacts had degraded, and much of the original documentation had either been lost, misplaced, or intentionally destroyed. Still, forensic re-examinations did manage to shed light on certain aspects of the crimes, particularly patterns in the wounds and timelines, helping experts narrow the Ripper's comfort zone within Whitechapel. These insights, though valuable, stopped short of delivering an answer. By the 1970s, the case had entered a new era, fueled by the rise of modern true crime fascination. Television documentaries and best-selling books reignited global interest, introducing millions of people to the story for the first time. One of the most influential publications of this period, Stephen Knight's Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, 1976, popularized the theory that the murders were linked to Freemasonry and a secret royal conspiracy. While heavily criticized by historians for its lack of credible evidence, Knight's book left an indelible imprint on the cultural narrative, inspiring countless films and speculative works. In the 1990s, another wave of controversy emerged when a Victorian-era diary allegedly belonging to Liverpool cotton merchant James Maybrick surfaced. The diary contained confessions attributed to Maybrick, leading many to believe the Ripper's identity had finally been revealed. Initially, the discovery generated global headlines, but handwriting experts, historians, and scientists soon raised doubts. Discrepancies in ink composition and inconsistencies in the timeline pointed strongly toward forgery. Despite this, the Maybrick Diary remains one of the most debated artifacts in Ripperology, a testament to just how powerful the desire for closure has become. The dawn of the 21st century introduced powerful new tools to re-examine the evidence, and for a moment, it seemed technology might finally deliver answers where Victorian policing had failed. The most significant breakthrough came in 2019, when researchers analyzed mitochondrial DNA extracted from a shawl said to have been recovered at the scene of Catherine Edow's murder. The results suggested a connection to Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-born barber long considered a prime suspect. News outlets worldwide declared the mystery solved. Yet almost immediately, controversy erupted. Critics pointed out that the shawl's chain of custody was questionable, its handling over 130 years far from secure, and the DNA samples themselves incomplete. Without definitive proof, the announcement became another chapter in the Ripper saga rather than its conclusion. Meanwhile, New names continue to emerge as researchers dig deeper into previously overlooked archives. Recently, renewed interest has focused on Joseph Barnett, Mary Jane Kelly's former partner, who lived with her until shortly before her murder. Barnett's intimate knowledge of Kelly's habits, his reported jealousy, and his proximity to the other victims make him a compelling figure for some modern investigators. Yet, as with many suspects, there is no conclusive evidence linking him to the crimes. More recently, investigative teams have begun using advanced geographic profiling to map the killer's likely movements, applying algorithms to the murder locations to determine where the Ripper may have lived or worked. These studies consistently highlight a small cluster of streets in the heart of Whitechapel, suggesting that the murderer likely resided in the very community he terrorized. This conclusion supports long-standing theories that the Ripper blended into the chaos of his surroundings, hiding in plain sight while avoiding suspicion. While forensic advances bring tantalizing possibilities, they also expose the fragility of the case. Much of the evidence has been lost, destroyed, or contaminated, and many critical witness statements were either ignored or deliberately withheld at the time. Combined with political pressures, a sensationalist press, and conflicting police jurisdictions, the result is a historical puzzle riddled with missing pieces. Every new claim must contend not only with time's erosion but also with the weight of over a century of speculation layered atop the original facts. Today, Jack the Ripper stands as more than just an unsolved murderer. He is a symbol of mystery itself, embodying humanity's fascination with the unknown. His crimes have inspired countless novels, television series, documentaries, and even modern tourism, with guided walks through Whitechapel offering chilling glimpses into the alleys where fear once ruled. But beneath the sensationalism lies a tragic truth often overshadowed by the hunt for the killer's identity. 5 women, Marian Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, lost their lives brutally, and their stories have too often been eclipsed by speculation about the man who killed them. In recent years, there has been a deliberate shift in how historians and writers approach the case, focusing more on the victims' lives, struggles, and humanity rather than reducing them to names on a list. And yet, the mystery refuses to rest. Each year brings forward new claims, alleged discoveries, and reinvestigations. The combination of unsolved brutality, missing evidence, and cultural obsession has turned the Ripper into a puzzle without a final piece. For every theory that appears to close the case, there is another waiting to unravel it, ensuring that more than 130 years later, Jack the Ripper remains as elusive as ever. By the early 21st century, Jack the Ripper's story had become more than just a historic crime saga. It had transformed into a cultural obsession that transcended geography, class, and even generations. The murders that once gripped the streets of Whitechapel in 1888 now belong to a worldwide audience, debated in universities, examined in documentaries, dramatized in television shows, and even memorialized in walking tours of the very alleys where the killings took place. Yet despite over a century of research, investigation, and speculation, the Ripper's true identity remains hidden behind layers of conflicting evidence, missing records, and competing narratives. It is this very uncertainty that keeps the case alive, ensuring that Jack the Ripper continues to haunt the collective imagination. As the decades passed, the fascination with the case only deepened. The Ripper became not just a mystery but an industry. Entire shelves of libraries filled with books proposing new suspects, entire conferences dedicated to analyzing theories, and endless online forums dissecting every known detail. Enthusiasts, often calling themselves Ripperologists, emerged as a dedicated community of amateur historians, detectives, and researchers who have committed years, sometimes decades, to solving the enigma. Some approach the investigation with rigor, consulting archives and cross-referencing Victorian police reports. Others dive into the more speculative, proposing theories involving secret societies, occult practices, and conspiracies tied to the British monarchy. The diversity of ideas keeps the case both alive and controversial, but it also ensures that definitive answers remain elusive. New technologies seem to promise breakthroughs that Victorian-era detectives could never have imagined. Forensic advances such as mitochondrial DNA testing, geographic profiling, and digital database cross-referencing have been applied to whatever fragments of evidence remain. The most headline-grabbing development came in 2019, when researchers examined a shawl said to have been recovered at the scene of Catherine et al.'s murder. Their DNA analysis reportedly pointed toward Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-born barber long considered a prime suspect by Scotland Yard during the original investigation. The announcement made global news, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the mystery had finally been solved. But almost immediately, the claim faced scrutiny. Critics raised serious concerns over the chain of custody. There was no verifiable record confirming the shawl's direct connection to the murder scene. Over the decades, it had passed through numerous hands, and contamination could not be ruled out. Others argued that the DNA evidence itself lacked clarity, with results suggesting a possible match but not an absolute one. The debate surrounding the Kosminski revelation reflects a recurring theme in the Ripper case. For every answer proposed, another layer of uncertainty emerges. Kosminski is far from the only suspect who has resurfaced in modern discussions. Recent academic work has reopened interest in other figures, such as Joseph Barnett, Mary Jane Kelly's former partner, whose jealousy and proximity to the murders make him an intriguing candidate. Then there's Montague John Druitt, a barrister whose apparent suicide shortly after the last canonical murder led some Victorian detectives to suspect his involvement. Still others point to Charles Lechmere, also known as Charles Cross, a carman who discovered the first victim's body and whose timeline and statements have come under renewed scrutiny thanks to modern investigative techniques. Each suspect offers compelling details but lacks definitive proof, keeping the debate alive more than 135 years later. Beyond DNA and suspects, newly uncovered documents have continued to shed light on the limitations and internal conflicts of the original investigation. Archival material from Scotland Yard and the Home Office has revealed political pressures behind the scenes, with competing jurisdictions between the City of London Police and the Metropolitan Police creating friction that hindered progress. Some investigators privately disagreed over who the prime suspect should be, while others clashed over strategies for dealing with the press. These divisions likely contributed to the failure to catch the killer, allowing the Ripper to exploit gaps in communication and escape capture. Modern ripperologists have also revisited the role of the Victorian press in shaping the narrative. In 1888, sensationalized headlines and exaggerated reports dominated newspapers, with journalists competing fiercely to outdo one another. Stories were often embellished, and rumors were presented as fact, permanently distorting the historical record. The image of the Ripper as a shadowy, almost supernatural figure stalking London's fog-covered streets owes as much to creative reporting as it does to reality. This media frenzy also gave birth to the infamous Jack the Ripper name, coined after one of the mysterious letters sent to newspapers at the time. Debate continues over whether any of these letters actually came from the killer or were fabricated by journalists hoping to drive sales. Documentaries and television series have amplified the Ripper's myth, giving new audiences immersive introductions to the case while sparking fierce debates within the research community. Some productions have leaned heavily into dramatization, prioritizing entertainment over historical accuracy, while others have tried to balance evidence and speculation. The History Channel, BBC, and other networks have invested in multi-part investigations featuring cutting-edge forensic analysis and interviews with leading experts. But even these often end without definitive conclusions. For every claim of a solved mystery, skeptics emerge to challenge the findings, ensuring that no single theory achieves consensus. Cultural fascination with the Ripper also extends far beyond academic and investigative circles. His crimes have inspired countless novels, films, and even graphic novels, ranging from faithful recreations of the Whitechapel murders to entirely fictionalized interpretations. Works like From Hell, Alan Moore's graphic novel later adapted into a film, wove historical details with elaborate conspiracies involving secret societies and royal cover-ups, shaping public imagination for years. The Ripper has been portrayed in horror movies, science fiction stories, and even television shows that transport him into alternate timelines. Each reinterpretation adds to the growing mythology, blurring the line between history and legend. Yet amid the speculation and sensationalism, a significant shift has occurred in recent years. Greater attention is being placed on the lives of the victims rather than just the mystery of the killer. Researchers, historians, and activists have worked to restore dignity to Marian Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Their stories of poverty, survival, systemic neglect, and personal hardship provide a critical perspective on Victorian London and challenge the narrative that reduces them to mere footnotes in the hunt for the Ripper. This reframing seeks to humanize the victims, allowing us to understand the conditions that made them vulnerable and the societal structures that failed to protect them. Despite the renewed focus on humanizing the tragedy, the appetite for answers remains insatiable. Each year brings forward new claims of final solutions, only to have them dismantled by fresh discoveries or more critical analysis. Online forums dissect archival records line by line, independent researchers invest in expensive DNA testing, and modern investigative techniques continue to reinterpret the evidence through new lenses. But time remains the greatest obstacle. Physical samples have degraded, original documents have vanished, and first-hand witnesses are long gone. More than 135 years after the murders, Jack the Ripper's identity remains unknown, and it is precisely this lack of resolution that fuels enduring fascination. Every generation returns to the mystery with new tools, new perspectives, and new suspects, hoping to succeed where others have failed. And yet, as each possibility falls apart under scrutiny, the case transforms further into a symbol of the limits of investigation, the power of storytelling, and humanity's enduring attraction to the unknown. The story of Jack the Ripper has always been as much about the absence of answers as it is about the crimes themselves. While the historical details of 1888 Whitechapel are well documented, the identity of the killer has remained elusive, leaving scholars, amateur detectives, and enthusiasts in a perpetual state of investigation. In recent years, advances in forensic science, digital technology, and archival research have given new life to the century-old mystery, bringing a fresh wave of attention and debate. Researchers now find themselves navigating a world where old evidence, once considered static, can be re-examined through lenses the original investigators could never have imagined. One of the most intriguing developments has been the application of artificial intelligence and advanced digital modeling to the historical records. Forensic teams and independent researchers have started using AI to analyze patterns in the killings, comparing handwriting in letters, geographic locations of the murders, and witness statements to identify correlations that may have been overlooked. AI-driven geographic profiling has suggested patterns in the locations of the canonical 5 murders that align with a highly localized area of residence or work, reinforcing some of the original investigators' theories while challenging others. While these analyses cannot provide definitive identification, they offer a statistical framework that informs where to focus future archival exploration or where historical suspects may have plausibly operated. Alongside computational methods, the forensic examination of artifacts continues to provoke controversy and interest. One of the most famous and contentious is the shawl associated with Catherine Eddowes, a victim whose murder occurred in Mitre Square. Researchers claim to have recovered mitochondrial DNA from the fabric, linking it to a suspect historically known as Aaron Kosminski. While the announcement made headlines, experts immediately cautioned that contamination, questionable provenance, and degradation over time complicated the findings. Nevertheless, the shawl has become emblematic of the tension between modern technology and historical evidence, a tangible object that raises more questions than it answers, keeping debate alive. Similar artifacts, including letters sent to newspapers and police, have been re-examined using modern forensic methods. Handwriting analysis, ink dating, and fiber analysis have all been applied in attempts to clarify authenticity and trace origins, but the results have been inconclusive, demonstrating both the potential and the limitations of contemporary tools when applied to a case over a century old. Another area of renewed research involves examining the social and environmental context of Whitechapel in 1888. Historians now incorporate urban geography, population density, sanitation issues, and the socio-economic dynamics of the East End into analyses of the murders. By mapping patterns of poverty, migration, and occupation, they can better understand why certain areas were more vulnerable and why particular victims might have been targeted. This contextualization does not point to a single individual but deepens understanding of the systemic vulnerabilities that enabled the crimes. Researchers now consider factors like the layout of alleys, availability of hiding places, and proximity to police precincts as critical to reconstructing the conditions in which the killer operated. This approach underscores the idea that Jack the Ripper was not just a product of his personality, but also a product of his environment, acting within a social and geographic framework that amplified his capacity to evade detection. Advances in digital archives have also provided access to previously overlooked documents. Police blotters, court proceedings, newspaper archives, and personal diaries have been digitized, allowing researchers across the globe to cross-reference information more efficiently than ever. Newly unearthed correspondences between officers, internal memoranda, and even letters from civilians provide insights into investigative practices, social attitudes, and potential leads that may have gone unnoticed during the original inquiry. These discoveries have reignited debates about various suspects, including less conventional theories that explore connections to immigrant communities, political radicals, and socially marginalized groups. While these hypotheses are often contentious, they reflect a modern willingness to explore historical mysteries through multiple dimensions of analysis rather than focusing narrowly on traditional suspects. One particularly compelling aspect of contemporary research is the use of forensic genealogy. By comparing genetic markers from surviving evidence with large databases of public genealogy, scientists have attempted to trace familial links that might reveal the killer's identity. Although results remain speculative and heavily debated, the methodology represents a radical departure from the investigative limitations of the late 19th century. This approach has opened ethical questions as well, particularly regarding privacy, consent, and the implications of posthumous identification, which continue to provoke discussion within the scientific and historical communities. The global fascination with Jack the Ripper has also intensified in the era of social media and online communities. Forums, blogs, and social networks have become virtual meeting places for amateur sleuths and professional historians alike. The case has evolved from Victorian newspaper sensationalism into a digital phenomenon where theories are proposed, critiqued, and disseminated almost instantaneously. In these communities, enthusiasts dissect every detail, from the angle of knife wounds to the timing of letters, often creating detailed visualizations or models to test hypotheses. These online platforms facilitate collaboration across continents and allow new perspectives to challenge long-standing assumptions, though they also perpetuate a level of speculation that can obscure historical rigor. Documentaries and docuseries continue to shape public perception as well. Many productions now incorporate modern forensic techniques, expert interviews, and historical reenactments to provide viewers with a comprehensive understanding of both the crimes and the challenges of solving them. Some emphasize the human cost, giving voice to the victims whose lives were cut short and their families, while others focus on the investigative challenge, portraying Jack the Ripper as an enigma that has persisted across generations. The balance between education, entertainment, and sensationalism is delicate, and while some productions have succeeded in presenting nuanced accounts, others have been criticized for glamorizing or mythologizing the killer. Despite the proliferation of theories, one constant remains: the difficulty of distinguishing fact from fiction. Over the decades, countless individuals have claimed to be the Ripper or have been posthumously suggested as the perpetrator, often based on circumstantial evidence or interpretation of ambiguous historical records. These claims, while intriguing, frequently collapse under scrutiny, highlighting the limits of historical investigation. Scholars emphasize the importance of separating verifiable evidence from conjecture, yet the allure of mystery ensures that the debate will continue, fueled by curiosity, imagination, and the human desire for closure. Public engagement with the Ripper case has also led to renewed interest in the social conditions of Victorian London. Walking tours of Whitechapel, museum exhibitions, and educational programs contextualize the murders within broader discussions of urban poverty, gendered vulnerability, and law enforcement challenges. These initiatives do more than entertain. They encourage reflection on societal structures that left individuals exposed to risk, and they honor the memory of the victims beyond their connection to the killer. By emphasizing historical context and humanizing those affected, these efforts balance fascination with responsible storytelling. The Ripper's story remains a lens through which we explore fear, crime, and morality. Modern investigations often reflect contemporary concerns: how technology can illuminate or obscure truth, how media shapes public perception, and how historical context informs our understanding of human behavior. New research, whether through DNA analysis, digital modeling, or archival discovery, constantly revises our understanding of both the crimes and the environment in which they occurred. Each breakthrough, even if inconclusive, reminds us of the intricate complexity of the case and the challenge of interpreting history without falling into speculation. Even in 2025, the Ripper remains a subject of fascination not just for those seeking to solve the historical puzzle but also for cultural analysts, psychologists, and criminologists who view the case as a window into fear, obsession, and societal failure. He is emblematic of a broader human fascination with the unknown and the unknowable. By studying the methods, context, and aftermath of his actions, researchers gain insight into human behavior, the vulnerabilities of social systems, and the ways in which crime resonates across time. Jack the Ripper's enduring presence in modern discourse demonstrates that historical crimes can never be fully disentangled from culture. Each decade reshapes the narrative, each new technology reframes the possibilities, and each scholarly effort adds depth to the portrait of both the killer and the victims. In Part 9 of this long investigation, it becomes clear that the pursuit of answers is as much about understanding society. Over a century has passed since the streets of Whitechapel were haunted by the elusive figure now known as Jack the Ripper, yet the case continues to captivate the public imagination. The murders, initially shocking for their brutality and apparent randomness, became emblematic of fear, societal vulnerability, and the dark potential of urban anonymity. Over the decades, new methodologies and perspectives have emerged. Yet despite modern technology and forensic innovation, the killer's identity remains officially unknown. This enduring uncertainty has shaped the Ripper not only as a criminal figure but as a cultural symbol, reflecting societal anxieties and our fascination with the unknown. Modern investigators approach the case from multiple angles. Historical research has benefited enormously from digitized archives, allowing scholars and enthusiasts to cross-reference newspapers, police files, and personal accounts with unprecedented speed. Digital modeling and AI-driven geographic profiling have enabled the identification of patterns in the locations of the murders, suggesting the killer's familiarity with specific areas of Whitechapel. These methods, while unable to provide a definitive answer, contribute to a richer understanding of the context in which the murders occurred and the likely behavioral patterns of the perpetrator. The advancement of forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, has reignited discussions around potential suspects. Mitochondrial DNA retrieved from certain artifacts, such as the shawl associated with Catherine Eddowes, has been compared to living descendants of historical suspects, including Aaron Kosminski. While some researchers assert that these findings point toward Kosminski, others emphasize the likelihood of contamination and the limitations inherent in DNA evidence that has been handled and stored over a century. These debates illustrate the broader tension between modern science and historical evidence. New techniques can provide insight, but they cannot entirely bridge the gap between the present and the uncertainties of the past. Beyond the technical aspects of investigation, there has been significant progress in understanding the societal conditions that made Whitechapel particularly vulnerable. Scholars have examined how dense housing, inadequate sanitation, and extreme poverty created environments in which vulnerable populations, especially women involved in sex work, could be targeted with limited risk to the perpetrator. These analyses also reveal the failures of contemporary law enforcement, constrained by limited resources and jurisdictional boundaries, which hindered coordinated investigative efforts. Such insights contextualize the murders, emphasizing that the Ripper operated not just as an individual but within a social ecosystem defined by systemic neglect and societal pressures. Recent research has also examined psychological and behavioral profiles of potential suspects, drawing from criminology and forensic psychology. By comparing known behaviors and crime scene evidence to historical suspects, researchers attempt to model the Ripper's likely psychological state and motivations. While some profiles suggest a man with obsessive-compulsive tendencies and a highly organized mind, others indicate a more impulsive and opportunistic character. The diversity of profiles reflects the ambiguity of the historical record but also demonstrates the enduring relevance of behavioral science in understanding crime. The cultural impact of Jack the Ripper has evolved alongside these scientific and historical inquiries. Literature, film, and television have repeatedly revisited the case, often blending fact and fiction to explore the intersection of horror, morality, and fascination. Novels and adaptations have cast the Ripper as everything from a shadowy avenger to a supernatural figure, underscoring how the mythos of the Ripper has grown independently of historical reality. This ongoing reinterpretation highlights society's need to process and narrate fear, to explore what is unknowable, and to grapple with the idea that some crimes may remain unsolved indefinitely. Online communities have amplified these discussions, transforming the Ripper from a historical case study into a global conversation. Enthusiasts share theories, analyze primary documents, and simulate investigative models, creating a collaborative environment where amateur and professional insights intersect. While some of these communities risk perpetuating speculation, they also demonstrate the enduring relevance of the case and the power of collective inquiry. People from diverse backgrounds, spanning continents and generations, remain engaged with the Ripper's story, reflecting a shared human curiosity about crime, justice, and morality. The victims, too, have become central to contemporary examinations of the case. Efforts to humanize Marian Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly have expanded our understanding beyond the sensationalist headlines of the 19th century. Scholars and writers have emphasized their lives, vulnerabilities, and social conditions, reminding us that the historical fascination with the Ripper is inseparable from the real human cost of the murders. This focus on victims underscores the ethical responsibility of contemporary analysis. While fascination with the criminal persists, it must be balanced with respect and empathy for those who suffered. Despite advances in forensic technology, historical research, and behavioral analysis, the Ripper's identity remains a subject of speculation. Numerous suspects have been proposed, including physicians, immigrants, and social outcasts, yet none can be definitively proven guilty. Even recent DNA breakthroughs, while promising, have not conclusively resolved the debate. This persistent ambiguity contributes to the mythic quality of the Ripper, as each generation revisits the case, applying contemporary tools and perspectives, yet finding the truth just out of reach. The Ripper thus serves as a mirror reflecting both the limits of our knowledge and the enduring human fascination with the unsolved. Public interest in Jack the Ripper also reflects broader themes about crime, media, and morality. The original press coverage sensationalized the murders, creating a template for public fascination with serial violence that persists today. Modern documentaries and investigative programs explore these same dynamics, analyzing how media shapes perception, fuels myth-making, and sometimes overshadows the realities of victims' lives. These studies remind us that the Ripper's story is not merely a historical case. It is an ongoing cultural narrative that continues to inform how society understands, consumes, and reacts to violence. In the end, Jack the Ripper endures as both a historical enigma and a cultural touchstone. He represents a point where criminal history intersects with social conditions, psychology, and media dynamics. The fascination with the Ripper persists because the case sits at the intersection of these forces, offering endless avenues for inquiry, interpretation, and debate. New technologies and methodologies may bring us closer to understanding who he was, but they also remind us that some aspects of human behavior, particularly when shrouded in history and anonymity, may remain forever elusive. Today, Jack the Ripper is remembered not only for the crimes committed over 130 years ago, but for the ways those crimes continue to resonate. Historians, criminologists, forensic scientists, and cultural commentators continue to study and debate the case, driven by the desire to understand both the individual and the society that allowed him to operate. His story challenges assumptions about violence, urban life, and the capacity for humans to perpetrate harm, while also highlighting the importance of historical context, ethical consideration, and analytical rigor in studying crime. While the Ripper's identity remains a mystery, the case offers a unique lens through which to explore broader societal questions. What conditions make individuals vulnerable to violence? How do societies respond to serial crime? How does media coverage shape public perception? These questions, intertwined with ongoing research and fascination, ensure that Jack the Ripper remains relevant, both as a historical case and as a cultural phenomenon. The continued study of Jack the Ripper demonstrates that even in the absence of conclusive answers, the process of investigation itself yields insight. Researchers learn not just about potential suspects, but about human behavior, social structures, and the enduring power of narrative. Each generation, armed with new tools and perspectives, approaches the case with fresh eyes, ensuring that the Ripper's story remains alive, complex, and provocative. As modern scholars, enthusiasts, and casual observers engage with the Whitechapel murders, the case becomes more than a historical curiosity. It becomes a reflection of our collective fascination with mystery, morality, and the unknown. The Ripper embodies the tension between fact and legend, history and myth, crime and culture. By exploring this story, we confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior and societal vulnerabilities, and we grapple with questions that remain as relevant today as they were in 1888. Jack the Ripper's legacy is not merely in the terror he inspired over a century ago, but in the enduring inquiries, analyses, and conversations his crimes continue to provoke. Each new study, each digital reconstruction, and each cultural representation deepens